Good afternoon and welcome to Liquid Lunch with the Regional Water Authority here on 103.5 WNHH. You can watch us anytime on the New Haven Independent's YouTube page or listen to us anytime as a podcast from Apple or Spotify. This is Kevin Watsey. I'm the Director of Public Affairs at the Regional Water Authority. And as you may know, I am a water nerd. Today's show is a fun one for me. If you've listened to some of our past shows, you may have gotten the idea that I like government affairs. It's where I started my career doing government affairs down in Washington, D.C. And with the start of the 2026 legislative session this week, I thought, what a better time to talk about what's going on up in Hartford specific to water. You may be wondering, why would they be caring about water up there? We're going to tell you all about that, and I'll tell you a couple of stories about my introduction to how every single possible thing in the world has a lobbyist in Washington, D.C., I learned that when I was 20, and it kind of blew my mind. But today we're going to talk mostly about the 2026 legislative session up in Hartford and water policy in general. And to help me do that is the Executive Director of the Connecticut Waterworks Association, Betsy Guerra. She is going to be busy starting this week for the next couple of months, making sure that our friends in Hartford do what's right for water policy in the state. So we'll spend a majority of our time talking about that. I hope folks walk away from this one saying, I had no idea water utilities had to spend this much time and energy thinking about government and politics. But before we do all that, we're going to start the way we always do by welcoming Betsy to the show and ask Betsy to tell us her story. So Betsy, welcome, and tell us your story. How did you get to where you are now as the Executive Director of CWWA?
Thank you, Kevin. It's great to be here. So how did I become Executive Director of CWWA? It's an interesting story, actually. I had been a lobbyist with the Connecticut Business and Industry Association for a little over 11 years. And then I went out on my own and started to look for clients to represent up at the state capitol. I did not have any background at all in water issues, but I had been, again, lobbying for a number of years. I also have a law degree, and I saw an ad in the Hartford Courant back when people put classified job ads in, and I responded. They were looking for a proposal as to what an individual could do as their executive director. They never had one before. And I submitted a proposal, waited, and then one day, and this was during the summer where we had a terrible drought, I was out walking in the woods nearby, and it started raining, and I had my cell phone, and all of a sudden I got a call from Larry Bingaman, who at the time was with Aquarion Water, later went on to become CEO of Regional Water Authority, and he said, congratulations, we're going to retain you to be the lobbyist for the Connecticut Waterworks Association. And then it started pouring. So in some way, I think I helped alleviate the drought conditions then. And I had a great introduction to water issues from not only Larry, but his colleagues in the industry. I found it to be a very collegial industry. And people are very passionate about what they do, the mission that water utilities have in meeting the state's public health, public safety needs, and also economic development, agriculture. When you think about how vital water is to all those areas, it makes you really passionate about water. And so it's been a great fit for me to learn about the water industry and to lobby up at the state capitol and before state agencies on water-related issues.
That's so interesting because, for me, I actually got into the business through an ad in the paper too. So who knew? I'm so glad you said that too, right? Because this is my third water company in my third state, and somebody last week asked me, what are the differences between the water companies? And I chose to answer what's the same. And the same is no matter what water company, what state, they're all the most dedicated, passionate people you will ever meet. They're not competitive. Their only goal is to treat water and get it to your house safely. And that's all, like I can tell you, inside the building, it's all we talk about. How can we improve our service? And it's just amazing. Before we start on this session, I want to lay some groundwork, because you said the word lobbyist, which a lot of people, I think is a four-letter word. They think it's a dirty word, lobbyist, special interests. I always tell people when they ask, about lobbyists, I always say, yeah, you call us lobbyists, but we're educators, right? We're educating these public officials who don't have the depth of knowledge that we have on a specific topic. So, lobbyists, whatever, but we're really educating them because these folks have to deal with so many issues. They don't know it all. So, is in your background, how would you explain to somebody what is a lobbyist?
Well, it does come up quite often. When I go to family reunions, my cousins sometimes look at me and say, in a very worried tone of voice, "Are you still lobbying?" And I think it's gotten a very bad reputation, in large part because of what happens in Washington. But in Connecticut, we have very tight regulations on what a lobbyist can spend on a public official. You can only spend up to $50 per year on any legislator. And when they adopted that legislation, what ended up happening was people no longer wanted to go meet for lunch or meet for dinner or a drink. All the meetings now are by and large in the legislators' offices or now by Zoom. And I think that's really changed the way that lobbyists are viewed in the state of Connecticut. We have to maintain very strict ethical guidelines. And so it has been interesting to see that evolve over time. But
yeah, I can remember, New Jersey still has pretty loose, laws when it comes to giving and fundraisers and all that, and I ran a PAC for my water company in New Jersey, so we were doling out checks left and right. I was going to fundraisers, but yeah, people could say you're buying access, but it really does give you the opportunity to talk to the legislators in a different kind of setting and educate them. And I always tell people in New Jersey, half the legislators never knew my name. They just knew me as the water guy. And I was fine with that.
Yeah, and it is interesting that, and you had mentioned this earlier, almost every organization has a lobbyist in Hartford, whether you're a nonprofit, whether you have programs to assist people that are facing poverty or food needs, things of that nature, social workers, every occupation you can think of, electricians, plumbers, burglar and fire alarm companies, they all have lobbyists in Hartford because state laws really impact the way that they do business. And when you look at an industry that is as complex as the water industry, where you're subject to not only complicated state regulations and state laws, but also on the federal level and at times on the local level, you really need someone there that can educate, as you said, educate lawmakers regarding the industry, what goes into bringing the water from the reservoir or the groundwater well to the tap. And there's a lot that goes into that to make sure that people are getting safe, high quality water at a reasonable cost. And that's been our mission, is to ensure that we can work with lawmakers and regulators to shape policies in a way that allows the water companies to continue to provide safe, reliable drinking water at a reasonable cost to their customers.
Yeah, and I said, I was a young buck in Washington, D.C., working in the United States Senate, and I was invited to sit with some of the senior staffers with some of their meetings, and it sticks with me, almost 30 years later, well, 25 years later. We had a meeting with the Natural Sausage Casings Association, and then an hour or two later, it was the Ball Bearings Association, and I just remember thinking, like, what? Why? But then it was explained to me, natural sausage casings. The farm bill was up, so they were talking farm subsidies. They were talking FDA regulation on what you can and can't do. What's the definition of a natural sausage casing? All this stuff, this association, who, farmers were the members of, it was very important to their livelihood how the government treated natural sausage casings. Ball bearings, the same thing. Steel tariffs, importing and exporting, all that stuff. So you think, what does somebody who makes ball bearings have to do in Washington? Well, what happens in Washington impacts their livelihood. So that was my first introduction to every profession, every industry has an association, and including the water the Connecticut water utilities. So you kind of mentioned it. Can you just give a brief overview of the CWWA? What is it and why does it exist?
Connecticut Waterworks Association is a trade association of municipal, private, and regional water utilities. So we represent every form of water utility ownership in the state. And we have our mission, as I mentioned, is to ensure that state public policies, whether they be laws or regulations, are positioned in a way to ensure that water utilities can continue to meet the public health, safety, economic development needs of the state and provide water at a reasonable cost to customers. And that's a big challenge, but it is something that we are very committed to. And I think what helps us up at the state capitol is that we speak with one voice, because we have very robust meetings, legislative committee meetings, board meetings, where we review proposed legislation. We talk about legislation that we need to address certain issues. And so when the bill is raised, we're again speaking with one voice to legislators so that they understand, oh, this is an important issue to the water utility in my district. It's also important to the water utilities on the other side of the state. And they're all in agreement as to how we should address that. So we also work with other groups, environmental organizations. We're part of the Water Planning Council. We serve on their advisory group and on some of their other working groups to help shape policy so that we understand that how it's going to impact water utilities, not only costs, but also operational issues. Because right now, water utilities are facing enormous operational challenges because of many state and federal requirements that they're required to comply with. So we're looking at things like treatment for PFAS, which is
perfect segue. We're going to talk about PFAS.
Okay.
Yeah.
I didn't know if I should, because it's a lot to talk about.
Yeah, and we've talked a little bit about it on this show. I've had, I think Tom Barger, our water quality manager. He's been on the show 3 times, and we've talked about PFAS a little bit. Before I get into that, though, you mentioned something interesting to me, and whenever I talk to association leaders, I always like to ask the question, are your members always kind of on the same page? And as the executive director, if you have certain members kind of on one side of a bill and certain members on another side, and how do you navigate that? Because you have to look out for the best interest of all your members, right?
We do, and we actually have a provision in our bylaws that indicates that if there is disagreement, that we can put the matter to a vote, and each member has one vote. Interestingly, I've been executive director for more than 20 years now. We have never had to vote on anything.
Wow.
We do have a provision in our bylaws that also provides that if there is a piece of legislation that negatively impacts one of our members, then we will not take a position in support of it or on the other side. So we need to make sure that we're representing everybody and that we're doing it in a very fair way. And we do that through consensus building. That's why our meetings throughout the legislative session can be long sometimes, because we want to make sure people are not only discussing the issues, but reviewing the legislation, which can be very complex and can be subject to different levels of interpretation. So far, so good. We've been able to navigate very well.
Can't say the same in New Jersey. I mean, you think that the split would be between like publicly owned and privately owned, but in New Jersey, most of the time it's about private versus private, because they just, there's just a distrust in New Jersey. So it's good to hear. I saw the look on your face. In New Jersey, there's one company that is like the 800-pound gorilla in the water industry, and the other smaller private companies kind of have a distrust of that big company because they think that if they support something, there must be something in it for them at the expense of the smaller private water companies. And so I worked for the 800-pound gorilla, so I saw it.
I think part of it, too, is the way that we're organized. We make sure that our board president rotates every year and that each form of ownership has a shot at being the president. Sometimes we have to double up, but by and large, we've stick to that philosophy. We also have legislative committee chairs. We call them tri-chairs because we have one from each form of ownership. So they are at the table making decisions. And when we're up at the Capitol and time can be of the essence, we make sure that our president and our legislative tri-chairs are available to provide us with input on an amendment or a proposal. And if we can't come to agreement, then we have to stay out of it.
Yeah.
But that has been a very successful process. I've often told other associations when they're looking to figure out how they can get into the lobbying world that this is the way that they should look at it, making sure that everybody has a voice in the organization, that it's not dominated by just the larger members, and that it's fair to everybody.
Yeah, and I'm sure when you were at CBIA, that was a bigger issue. You had, competing priorities from your members, and because they have a lot of members. It's not like CWWA; they have probably thousands of members.
Yeah, it can be a big issue, and they have a very diverse type of membership.
Yeah.
Where they have manufacturers, healthcare providers,
Right.
insurance, etc. So very different.
Yeah. So you mentioned PFAS, and that's actually where I wanted to start on my list because it's one of those issues that I think people hear about. They might not quite understand it. What's going on with PFAS? What is PFAS? So can you, and because you're not a water scientist, I think you're actually a good person to kind of give a 10,000-foot overview of what is PFAS and kind of what's the issue with PFAS.
Sure. Well, you mentioned Tom Barger, and that you've
Yep.
had him talking about PFAS. So one of the things that we also do as part of an association is rely on those experts
Yep.
in our organizations to provide us with information on how to approach certain issues. PFAS is certainly one of those. It's a very complex issue. So there are a number of different substances referenced as that fall under that umbrella of PFAS, or the forever chemicals. And they have been in products for years. And it wasn't until recently that they discovered that there were certain health risks associated with these. And as technology became more effective, water utilities and others that are testing for PFAS in soil or in wastewater can actually begin to see PFAS at a lower level than they had in previous years. So it's not a new thing. In fact, years ago, the water utilities were required to test water and determine PFAS levels. But again, because the technology was much different and the laboratories could only distill down so far to determine the level of PFAS, there was no indication that it was going to be a serious issue. Now that the limits are lower that water utilities have to test for, it is a challenge. And so water utilities throughout the state, throughout the country, are testing for PFAS and beginning to determine how to best treat that to ensure that the water continues to be safe for customers. But one of the things that we're talking about to legislators is that PFAS is not something that water utilities add to the water. It's something that gets into the water supply, usually from manufacturing sites or landfills, transfer stations, from firefighting areas, places where there have been fires, airports, things of that nature. So unless we begin to remove PFAS from those areas and remediate the soil, it's going to continue to contaminate the water supply. And treating and testing is expensive. So we want to make sure that there's a comprehensive effort to address PFAS. And so far, it's been a good experience in Connecticut. They have adopted legislation to eliminate PFAS from many consumer products. They're also beginning to test soil near certain priority areas, like near closed landfills, to determine amounts, and they're getting rid of that, and that's important. So we're working together, but the rules keep kind of changing. We're keeping an eye on what's happening on the federal level to see if anything changes. But there's also sometimes state legislation that's introduced. And what we want to make sure when we're looking at state legislation is that it's not imposing a conflicting burden on water utilities, that they understand what the feds are already requiring, what the water utilities are already doing so that we can address it in a way that's cost effective and also effective in terms of protecting the safety of customers.
This is where the education part comes in, because a legislator may have all the good intentions of the world, but they might not know what's happening at the federal level or what water companies are already doing. I always tell people when they ask me what PFAS is, I said PFAS is the reason you love most of the products you love. It's what makes your things stain resistant, what makes your pans non-stick. It's what puts out fires. It's in deodorant. It's literally in everything.
Really is dental floss.
Dental floss and
dryer sheets.
And I think I read something that if people got their blood tested for PFAS, like 95% of humans in the country have PFAS in their blood. It's just because the chemical is so prevalent. And as it stands now, the federal recommendation, there's no regulation right now, but it's a guideline, is 4 parts per trillion. Do you have a fun way of explaining parts per trillion? Because if you don't, I'll throw one out there. But
I don't, but I do have an interesting, when they first proposed legislation in Connecticut, some of the environmental groups that were advocating for the bill talked about parts per billion. And they testified that we need parts per billion, a limit that affects that. And they did not understand the difference between parts per billion and parts per trillion. So I love to hear your story about.
Well, I always say,
that.
I always tell people to picture a trillion grains of salt that look exactly the same. And now you have to go find 4 of them that are different chemically but look exactly the same. It's not easy, and the reason that it's at 4 is because the testing methodology is only accurate down to 4 parts per trillion. Just as a little bit of an aside, the Regional Water Authority, we actually post our quarterly PFAS test results on our website, and we're in very good shape. So if you want to go look at the water quality tab on our website and see our quarterly test results for the PFAS chemicals that we test for, feel free to do that. But, I know some of the other water companies in the state are not as well off as we are when it comes to PFAS. And as you said, the treatment is very expensive. And you go ahead.
Well, and it's changing. The technologies are changing. So every time we go to a conference, an association conference, we're hearing about new treatments. And I'm not an expert, so I'm not going to elaborate on those. But it is exciting to see that they are on the cutting edge of some technologies that will assist water utilities in remediating and treating PFAS in ways that will be a lot more cost effective.
Yeah. My water company in New York estimated they were going to spend $120 million to treat for PFAS, and then they were going to have to hire 2 to 3 people just to manage that PFAS treatment, because the filters that you use have to be turned over very frequently, because if you don't turn them over, then it starts putting PFAS back in the water, and that creates a whole other issue, right?
Right, and that's why we're talking to legislators about the challenges facing water utilities. There's certainly challenges that the industry is committed to meet, but there are some significant challenges. So in addition to PFAS testing and treatment, there's also the lead service line replacement program, where utilities are now inventorying, or they completed their inventory of every lead service line within their service area, including things like pigtails and components that include lead. And to do that was a very exhausting process. They had to look at old building records, and they did surveys and asked customers to provide information on whether or not they've replaced any of their lines recently, and what date, and what they're composed of, and things of that nature. So really a huge effort. And then the next step following the inventory will be to then assist customers in replacing those lead service lines. So another challenge. On top of that, and we've seen this in the news recently, is just the ongoing need to replace aging infrastructure, because in the Northeast, as you know, our water infrastructure in some places can be very, very old, sometimes over 100 years old. We always have stories at these conferences where a utility say, you know, they just dug up a pipe and it was actually made of wood or something.
We have no wooden pipes in our system at the RWA.
And so the ongoing replacement is expensive. And you also have more people that want to access water from a water utility rather than a well because they face the same challenges in trying to keep it safe and reliable. And so they're talking about now about how do we ensure that water utilities can extend water mains to provide service in some of these areas that are facing challenges, either because of PFAS or road salt contamination or some other contaminant, and it's very expensive. And so although there's some funding coming from the federal government, it really hasn't been enough to meet the infrastructure needs of the water utility. So we're trying to get people to understand that there is an important need and that it's going to benefit customers if we provide additional funding for water infrastructure here in Connecticut.
And you know, back to PFAS for a second, one of the things I like to kind of point out, and you had mentioned it, is, you know, water companies did not put the PFAS in the water, but we have to take it out. And by taking it out, we now have this filter media, it's called, but the stuff out of the filters that now has PFAS in it. And some people then want to start treating water utilities as PFAS producers because now we have this contaminated filter media that has PFAS in it, and that's where the government steps in to help say, no, the water company's doing the right thing. They shouldn't be penalized because that's just a byproduct of what they have to do. So, but yeah, and it's, again, it's very expensive. They're looking at new technologies, as you said, to get the costs down for PFAS. But and it's when you talk to water utilities, it's one of those things where they don't want to jump too soon on the treatment because they don't want to spend $100 million, and then when they get done, find out there's a better technology that would have cost half as much. So you mentioned lead and copper, and what's going on? Is there anything specific going on in Hartford this session related to lead and copper, or are you more just keeping your eyes and ears open for anything?
Nothing specific relative to lead and copper. I think in CWWA's government affairs agenda, which we put together each year, we do talk about the need to assist customers in funding these, because water utilities, when the issues relative to lead first emerged, they were already replacing those lines. What's left, however, are the lines from the curb stop inside, and that's the customer's responsibility. So we are looking at ways of assisting customers in replacing those lines so that it doesn't impose a huge financial burden on them. But I don't expect any other type of issue to come up.
Yeah.
But you never know. You never know what experience somebody has had.
Yeah.
So you have to be vigilant, and that's why you need a lobbyist in Hartford, is to read all of the laws that are introduced, all the amendments, and to make sure that none of them impact your company, your profession, in a way that can be very problematic.
Yeah, and outside of kind of the umbrella of the CWWA, I'm going to a meeting on Friday where a bunch of the water companies get together on a quarterly basis to just talk about how our lead and copper programs are going and what roadblocks we've hit and how we've overcome them, and even just sharing things like this is the letter we sent to our customers, and things like that. As far as the RWA, and I'll just throw out there where we're at on that, our inventory is on the website. You can go plug in your address and see. I'm not going to say you can see whether you have lead or not. What you can see is what our records say. Because our records, we may have a record that goes back to 1942, and that's the most recent record we have. So we always ask people, go on, see what our records say, and if you could send us a picture to verify what's right, what's wrong, we'll send somebody to your house to verify what we have. You also mentioned the replacement. The RWA this year is going to be kicking off our replacement program. We're going to be replacing known lead and galvanized lines starting in Milford, because our own inventory showed that we have more in Milford than any other town that we know of right now. But we also have a good amount of what we call unknowns. So our records aren't telling us what people have. We don't know what's out there. So we need to flip those unknowns to knowns, and then we'll kind of go from there. But we're very excited to be kicking off our replacement program, and the RWA is paying for customer side replacements. And I said Tom Barger had been on the radio 3 times now. 2 of those 3 have been to talk about lead and copper. We could do hours on lead and copper. You also mentioned infrastructure. Infrastructure is one of those things, it's a fancy word for the pipes in the ground and the network. Some of our friends around the state have had some media attention lately with their infrastructure. And that's no comment, I would say, on how they do or don't maintain their system. As you said, the infrastructure's old and it's costly to maintain. It's between, I always tell people, $1.5 million and $2 million a mile to replace a water main right now. That's everything from the equipment, the labor, the paving, because every town now wants you to do curb to curb, corner to corner, give me a fresh new street since you're opening the road anyway. And so CWWA, you guys are trying to kind of help us with the funding, right, to take the burden off customers.
Exactly. So there are some pots of money available. One is the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, but that is primarily a loan fund, and it provides low-interest loans to utilities. But a loan is not going to necessarily be the cure that we need to address these challenges. Water utilities are looking for additional funding for treatment of PFAS and things of that nature, as well as aging infrastructure. I think there's some misconceptions, and that's one of the things that we're trying to dispel at the state legislature. For example, there's also a Clean Water Fund, and the Clean Water Fund is funded through millions and millions of dollars, and in addition to low interest loans, it also provides direct grants to municipalities, but it's primarily focused on pollution prevention, on things like phosphorus and nitrogen removal from wastewater facilities. It is not focused on water infrastructure. And that's one of the things that we're trying to impress on people, that you look at this, millions and millions of dollars, but again, that's on the wastewater side. The SRF fund, unfortunately, again, is limited in terms of the grant component. And so we need to make sure that those legislators understand that, and that they could put additional funding that would provide some direct grants to the water utilities to offset the costs that would ultimately be borne by the customers and rates.
Yeah, I've seen in my career, and this is no comment on this state or any legislator that I have or have not ever met, but the legislatures in general are very good at telling water companies what to do and then complaining about the rates that they charge when they do it. There's a water company in New Jersey that I'm aware of that put PFAS treatment in, and they decided to put a line item on their bill separate from the water supply bill just for PFAS, and that charge is now more than the water bill. The average water bill in that town is about $75 a month, and the PFAS charge is $133 a month. And to their credit, nobody's complaining about it, because now they're not just seeing a high water bill. They can see with their eyes that $133 a month is just to pay for that treatment. And, it has worked for them, but it's expensive. And, we call it unfunded mandates, right? You have to do X, Y, and Z, but figure it out.
And when you look at water rates overall, it's not a lot of money.
Penny a gallon.
Penny a gallon, like that. And it's interesting that whenever a utility is looking to increase rates, and they can justify it based on these new requirements, and as you mentioned, it costs a lot to replace a water main, million and a half. And people get very upset, and they try to push back against any kind of increase in water rates. They don't understand everything that goes into it. It falls from the sky. It's in the ground. How much can it possibly cost to bring it to my faucet? They don't seem to have a firm understanding of that, and I think we need to do a better job of communicating to the public as to what goes into the water treatment distribution processes, and why it's important that we continue to invest in water infrastructure. We're going to be talking about that during the legislative session this year. We're hoping to get some traction on that because not only does it ensure that we have good, clean water, it also does create some jobs in the construction sector and others. So it's an important issue.
And one of the things I've talked about on this show a number of times is what I call the silver tsunami, right? Yeah, so, 45% of our workforce could retire tomorrow with their full benefits, their full pensions, and, I call it the one bad day plan. One bad day and I'm retiring. And I know workforce development, refilling that pipeline, pun intended, to get workers in is on your agenda. So what is CWWA looking at as far as, workforce development is concerned with water?
We're looking for a few different things. So as you mentioned, there's been an unprecedented number of retirements in the water industry, and other industries are facing this as well. So we're not that unique. Water utilities are required, however, to have on-site 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, water system operators that need to be certified by the state. So there's certified water treatment, water distribution, and small system operators. And it's been a real challenge to try to fill those positions. And although we're focused on trying to attract people to the profession, and the Connecticut section, AWWA has been doing a lot in that regard in terms of promoting careers in the water sector, making scholarships available, encouraging students to come to meetings and get to know the water industry. Some utilities are offering internship programs, on-site training, etc. It has still been a challenge to get those water system operators certified by the state. Now, part of it is that it's been a process to get people ready for the exam, and the people, unfortunately, there was a huge failure rate of people when they took the exam. It's kind of a little bit of an odd thing. You could be a technical person. You're the kind of kid that works well with your hands, seems like a natural, but there's a certain math component that seems to be tripping people up. And so the section is focusing a lot on providing some prep for people taking the test to improve that failure rate. The Department of Public Health drinking water section administers the examinations. They also are concerned about the failure rate, and they have made some changes to the exam. They're also providing training to make sure that people have a better understanding of some of the requirements. And so they have indicated that that rate is going up, which is good news. But we do want to address some of the flaws in the process. So, for example, you submit an application indicating why you're qualified to sit for the exam, what your background is, what your training and experience is. If you fail that exam, instead of being able to retake it the next week, like you could if you were some other profession like a realtor, you end up having to submit another application demonstrating what your qualifications are, which doesn't make a lot of sense to us, and it creates these delays. And when you have a young person or someone that's trying to change their career and they're looking at different options, if they're facing delays, it may mean that they're looking somewhere else, that they're going to give up on the water sector. And that's unfortunate. So we're trying to address that to say there's no reason why you need to submit the same application. Your education and experience is not changing for the worse. If anything, you're going to add some more training that you've gotten. And so we're hopeful that we can move forward with that. A lot of it, however, is going to be working with universities, colleges like Gateway Community College, Southern Connecticut State University. They have some programs that are geared to trying to attract people to the water industry, including a public utility management degree, which not only for the water but for other utilities. to ensure that they have that expertise to be able to step into a company. Because when you talk, we mentioned how passionate people are. I remember my first day on the job, it happened to be at one of our conferences, and people came up and introduced themselves, and almost every single one of them had been in the industry for decades.
Yeah.
And very passionate. They had no issues with waking up. There was a water main break, got to go out, make sure the crew's out, fixing it. They were committed to that. They were, again, their enthusiasm and passion was just very intense. And so when you see that those people are now retired, it's hard to get people to understand that and to have that same passion. But I think the best way to do that is bringing them in through these internships, job shadowing, on apprenticeship training and things of that nature seems to be the best way. Because once the people are in the door, they seem to stay.
Yeah.
And that's positive for the water industry.
Yeah, you talk about passion, during this latest snowstorm we had, if you're listening to this here in February, our treatment operators slept at the plants because they didn't want to risk not being able to get at the plant because, as you said, we have to have people there 24/7. We had some of our facilities folks sleeping at Sergeant Drive in case there was a main break so that they could plow the parking lot so our trucks could roll. These are dedicated people. And, you're talking about the tests and all that, and I don't think anybody's talking about making the test easier because you want the test. Obviously, these are people that are treating your water, so you don't want to make it too easy, but you just want to get some of the hurdles out of the way. And I took a water treatment class. It's hard.
Is it?
Yeah, I mean, it's the math, like you said, the math. They'll throw out, if this many gallons is going through and the turbidity is this, how much chlorine do you need to put in per 100 gallon? And it's like you have to do complex math. You have to convert. It's hard. And that's why these folks that run these treatment plants, they are the smartest. That treatment operator's license, I always say, is gold. You have that license, you could go anywhere you want, and it's gold. But it's hard to get. And not only do you need like a treatment license, but there's also licenses to operate what's called the distribution system, the network of pipes that brings the water out of the plant to your house. That requires licenses too. And there's different levels of licenses, and those tests are hard. Now you're talking about, volume in the pipe and how do you chlorinate a pipe during a main break and all that stuff. So there's a lot of knowledge that goes into running a good water system. I also wanted to talk to you because CWWA is not your only thing. You are also executive director of Council of Small Towns. I
am.
So can you talk a little bit about what is the Council of Small Towns?
Well, sure. Before I get into that,
Yeah, sure.
So when I was retained as CWWA's executive director, and because that association is primarily a lobbying group, they actually encouraged me to have other clients because I am an independent contractor. And I did represent about 14 different clients throughout the years. And then in the last few years, decided when I became executive director of the Council of Small Towns that would limit it to those two. So COST, otherwise known as COST, is a advocacy organization made up of small towns with a population of less than 35,000, although most of our members are much smaller than that. And we advocate at the state capitol on issues that affect our small towns. So that can be a wide range of issues, primarily things like education aid, special education funding, town aid road funding, infrastructure funding, and also looking at things like environmental compliance issues. So towns are now facing a lot of challenges relative to solid waste management, for example, because of the closure of the facility in Hartford, which ended up, which had at that point been addressing some of the solid waste management issues. now that solid waste is being shipped out of state, which is costly, and from an environmental perspective, it's not beneficial either. And so they're looking at things like creating product stewardship programs. For example, with respect to tires, hard-to-handle items that would end up either in landfills or on the side of the road. And they're also looking at ways of expanding the capacity of the state's remaining trash-to-energy facilities. But again, very complex issues. They also look at a lot of housing issues. So that's one of the issues in the last couple of years that has been at the forefront.
Like affordable housing.
Discussions, affordable housing. How do we promote affordable housing in a way that is going to be effective and without imposing certain administrative and cost burdens on our municipalities? So that was a big discussion with the housing bill. There are some issues relative to water there, because when we're talking about affordable housing, you're typically talking about higher density housing, and there are some rural areas, some other smaller communities that don't have sufficient water or wastewater capacity to support that kind of development. They don't have a lot of buildable land remaining, or their land is protected by conservation easements like watershed land. So the issues do sometimes intersect, but it ensures that we are taking a very broad look at some of these issues in the state.
So why is it important that the small towns have their own representation separate from just an organization that represents all the local governments? Like, what can you name like one issue where maybe cost would be not aligned with an organization that represents, Bridgeport, Hartford, Waterbury, bigger cities?
A lot of it comes down to funding, because when COST was created about 51 years ago, there was some concern that the leadership in Hartford was dominated by politicians, legislators from urban areas, and that the decisions about funding were made to reflect that. And so the cities were getting a significant amount of funding, which is to be expected because their needs are great. We understand that. But we wanted to make sure that smaller towns got their fair share of funding as well. And so that was one of the reasons that COST was created back then. There are issues that are very specific to small towns. For example, the resident state trooper program. People are always surprised by this, but there are a little over 80 municipalities in the state out of 169 that actually do not have their own local police department. They either rely on a resident state trooper, sometimes in conjunction with constables, or they rely totally on the state trooper barracks. And so if somebody has an issue, they have to call the state trooper barracks, and they provide that public safety coverage. So that is an issue when they were trying to increase costs associated with that program. That COST was very instrumental in pushing back against that to ensure that it continues to be a viable program. There was an issue with school regionalization, where they wanted to mandate that schools of a certain size, if they only served a certain population of students, had to consolidate to save costs. And that's where, again, the education comes in, because if you mapped it out, that would have meant in some rural areas you were putting a kid on a bus for more than an hour each way, instead of the school that was maybe 10 miles down the road. And those costs would have ended up being more than if they just maintained the school in that particular district. So consolidation wasn't the panacea everybody kept thinking it was. So it's making sure that that small town perspective gets heard. We do work with the Connecticut Conference of Municipalities very well. We work with them in trying to address the concerns with the major housing bill that the governor ultimately vetoed, and that has produced, a very good working relationship. So by and large, we work together, but we're just there to provide that fine point on issues affecting small towns so that we don't get lost in the shuffle.
And further proof that every group needs advocacy, whether you're ball bearings or small towns in Connecticut. Yeah, it's so interesting because coming from New Jersey, one of the things I had to learn was the differences in the government in Connecticut, right? Because talking to school districts, New Jersey has 565 municipalities and 615 school districts. They have a bunch of school districts that have no schools, and they're just sending districts. They send it, but they have a superintendent who's making $200,000 a year just to make sure that the town next door is educating his town's kids the right way. Yeah, it's a problem. Regionalization in New Jersey should be happening because, I think there's 6 towns in New Jersey that have less than 15 people living in them.
And cost does support efforts to regionalize certain functions where it makes sense.
Where it makes sense, that's the key.
Where
yes.
It's not going to undermine the quality of the service, or it's not going to save any money.
Yeah, I mean, how is it good for a kid to sit on a bus for 2 hours a day? I mean, I see, where I live in Naugatuck, and we live as far from the high school as you could possibly get while still being within Naugatuck. And I see these kids waiting out for the school bus at 6:45 in the morning, and it's miserable. Like why? Now I sound like an old man. In my day, we didn't, have to get on the bus that early. But yeah, now you're telling kids you got to get on a bus at 6 o'clock in the morning to get to school by 7:15, and you're not going to get home till 5 o'clock. I mean, that's.
And as a result, a lot of people are dropping their kids off at the schools. And so you see these buses that are driving through the neighborhoods half empty.
Yeah. And then you have the line of cars, 40, 50 deep at the school, which creates a whole safety issue, it's that trickle down thing. So we got about 8 minutes left. I want to end this portion and go on to what I lovingly call the 5 unrelated questions, which are questions that have nothing to do with what we've been talking about for the last hour, but they just help us to get to know you a little bit better. And we always start with, do you have any pets?
I do have a pet. I've always had dogs, sometimes a cat, but I have a dog named Rudy, and sometimes you can hear him when we have Zoom meetings. He's quite boisterous.
What is Rudy? What kind of dog?
He is supposed to be a golden doodle, but he's also supposed to be a mini golden doodle. But he's not that miniature. He's about 40 pounds of pure muscle, and he's not quite 2, and he has been quite the handful. He's calming down a bit, but he is on high squirrel alert all the time. And he's puzzled by this recent snowstorm because he can't figure out where to go to his business. So that has been a little bit comical.
That's funny. Yeah. And, I'm a cat guy, so I don't really think about the poor dogs that have to figure out where to go when there's 1.5 feet of snow on the ground.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about this, is why hasn't anybody ever figured out a way, kind of like a litter box? I mean, I know it would be challenging with a larger dog, but some way to have them be able to do something somewhere else other than walk 2 miles.
And if you have a little dog like a Chihuahua, then it's no different than a cat, really.
Right. So.
Next question. Who's your favorite band or musician?
Oh, okay. Well, my brother has always been the music guy. He actually was a DJ in Atlanta.
Oh.
So I kind of always relied on him, and he would just funnel music to me. So it was always things like the Go-Go's, the B-52s, Bob Seger, Elton John. That was his favorite. But I actually first bought the Yellow Brick Road album way back in the 1970s. But he just informed me the other day that he's glommed it from me, and he still has it. So.
Huh. Yeah, so I used to, when I was in college, I worked backstage at a concert venue in New Jersey, and you mentioned the Go-Go's and the B-52s, and it just kind of, they toured together when I worked there, and 2 of the most not nice people that I met backstage was Fred Schneider from the B-52s and Belinda Carlisle from the Go-Go's.
Really?
Yes,
wow,
they were
too
not
bad.
very nice. And really, the list of not nice musicians is only probably less than 10, but those two were on it. They just were
Well,
kind of
they used to have
nasty.
some great concerts at Lake Compounds, and the Go-Go's were there, B-52s, Stevie Ray Vaughan,
Oh.
very good.
And the B-52s, I just saw them on TV doing a live thing, and he's in his late 70s. One of the women is in her late 70s, and they still sound pretty dang good.
Yeah.
It's kind of nice. Next question. Cookies, brownies, or ice cream?
All of the above, really.
You can only pick one.
Ice cream, I guess.
What kind?
Vanilla and chocolate.
I'm the same way. A little bit of
Patch.
both.
A little bit of
A
both.
little bit of both.
Hood, which, by the way, is a Connecticut company. I know that from my CBIA days.
Ah,
Makes that great vanilla and chocolate patchwork ice cream.
yeah, I'm a big vanilla chocolate guy. Last question. Who's your favorite teacher in school and why?
I had a lot of favorite teachers. The one that got me into this politics, I have to say, and now I'm trying to, Mr. Navage, my high school teacher. I took a lot of poli-sci classes in high school, which they fortunately had. And he said to me, you know, if you're really interested in this, the best way to get more involved is to volunteer for a candidate. He goes, I would suggest you volunteer for an incumbent, not because I'm leaning any particular way politically, but it's a good way to get your feet wet. And so I did. I went and I volunteered for Congressman Ron Saracen at the time, who was running for re-election in the 5th District. It's a long time ago. And I loved it. It was very exciting. And so it kind of led me toward majoring in political science and then interning at the state capitol and then ultimately going to law school, basically so that I could become a lobbyist. Back then, most of the companies required an attorney's degree, a law degree, in order to become a lobbyist because you're reading statutes, regulations, you're drafting those things. So he was definitely one of the more influential, but I was fortunate to have a lot of good teachers. My mom was also a teacher in a different school in the same district, and I think I got a little bit of favoritism because of that.
Nice. Well, Betsy, thank you for coming on this edition of Liquid Lunch with the Regional Water Authority. One thing I'd like our listeners to take away from this conversation is folks like Betsy are up in Hartford every day during the session educating legislators on issues that are important not just to the industry but to the customers that depend on that industry. And, there's the law of unintended consequences. These legislators have good intentions with these bills, but the unintended consequences need to be explained to them. So folks like Betsy and Nicoletta, who's on my team, are up there making sure that they understand that. So with that, thank you for listening, and until our next show, stay hydrated and stay warm because it's cold out there.